everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 115 of the Movement Debrief. And today, folks, we're about to get super serial. We're going to talk about all things infrasternal angles. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, it is ISA Day Friday. We're going to deep dive into some measurement stuff regarding that, some compensatory activity that's involved with the infrasternal angle, and of course, most importantly, what you going to do about it. I got a gang of questions that have been asked by the people. They'll be answered for the people by this people right here, fam recognized fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from Eric. Here's what Eric asks. Hey, Big Z, I'd like to see what happens with a wide ISA and the changes in regards to pump handle. Could you take this a couple steps further in a future debrief and describe both a wide and a narrow infrasternal angle? I am interested in hearing the layer by layer compensatory mechanics over time in both the thorax and the pelvis, as the body must continue to find ways to inhale and exhale. If that's not too much, could you then describe expectations in regards to testing? Eric, this is a beast of a question, but I'm ready to slay the beast. No animals were harmed in the making of this debrief, folks, though, don't worry. All right, infrasternal angles. You have two types, two gross types. You have a wide infrasternal angle, which I would classify as someone who's got a total angle of their rib cage at 110 degrees or above. On the other side, you got a narrow infrasternal angle who is sitting somewhere around 90 degrees or below. Now you're probably wondering, well, Zach, you left out 90 to 110. What the hell's going on there? Stay tuned. Let's just talk about these gross extremes and then we'll work towards the middle. The way the infrasternal angle forms when we're talking about a loss of dynamic capabilities has to do with someone's body structure. With a wide strategy, there's certain genetic, structural, and anthropometric predispositions that lead someone to being wide, and vice versa with someone who's narrow. None of these are bad. The key with a wide and narrow infrasternal angle or anything in between is that the infrasternal angle has to be dynamic. What is a dynamic infrasternal angle? Well, I'm glad you asked. A dynamic infrasternal angle should, as you breathe in, move laterally and superiorly or outward and upward during the inhale, and during the exhale it should close, it should move downward and inward. This action is called the bucket handle mechanism of the rib cage. Called the bucket handle action because if you take a bucket and you move the handle, the ribs move similarly in that regard. Wides are good at the inhalation side of bucket handle, so they're more outward and upward. Narrows are good at the exhalation side of bucket handle, so they're more downward and inward. Those people in the middle, the 90 to 110, they're not really good in either direction. Now, how does a loss of dynamic capabilities happen with an infrasternal angle? The way it happens is you have some loss of normal respiratory mechanics within someone's body, however it happens. We all, to some degree, have a bias toward inhalation. I do want to preface that. And the reason why that is there's always air in the lungs, hashtag dead space. And that also just allows us to expand and take up space. But if we look at respiration in total, you have two strategies. You either are breathing in or you're breathing out. Your whole body is moving to some degree with each inhalation and exhalation. If we talk about the ventral cavity, thorax, abdomen, and pelvis, the ventral cavity should expand in all directions during inhalation, and it should compress in all directions during exhalation. That's normal mechanics. If we look to the spine, when I breathe in, the spine should move posteriorly. That's filling the posterior aspect of the ventral cavity. So what that will look like is the sacrum is going to counternutate, which is tipping backwards. The lumbar spine is going to be more flexed. You're going to have increased posterior expansion of the thoracic region. And then you're going to also have lower cervical flexion and OA extension to open up the airway. That's a normal inhale. An exhale simply reverses that to the start position. So instead of the forces moving backward, everything's going to be moving forward. What's going to happen at the spine is sacrum's going to nutate or tip forward, which will tilt the pelvis forward. The lumbar spine should extend. You're going to see more extension in the upper thorax, not necessarily flattening, but just going back to the start position. And then in the cervical spine, you're going to see lower cervical extension and upper cervical flexion, relatively. That's normal mechanics. Now, let's suppose that for whatever reason, I have a loss of that mechanism, a restriction in movement options. This could happen for a wide variety of reasons: stress, managing, gravity, all types of wild and crazy things. We probably don't know the full extent, and it's likely idiosyncratic, and also probably genetic to some degree. People are going to be biased towards using more of an inhalation strategy or an exhalation strategy at the axial skeleton. If we look at that continuum, spine moving backwards or spine moving forwards, people are going to be biased one direction or the other. That doesn't mean that they're a black belt or they're completely all the way in one direction, or vice versa. They just have a bias that way. So let's say I have an exhalation bias. So the sacrum is more nutated. Lumbar spine, increased lordosis, flatter thoracic spine. OA flexion, lower cervical extension. You still got to breathe in that case. If I have an exhaled axial skeleton, there's good research out there, in fact, showing if you don't take a breath of air in that state, you'll die. The easiest place for your body to compensate, to complete that opposition of the strategy, is at the lower rib cage, the false ribs in particular. The reason why it's easier to do so at the false ribs is because they don't have that common shared sternal attachment. They have more flexibility in this region. So they can have that compensatory inhalation strategy happen at the lower rib cage. This is good in the sense that you can now complete the respiratory cycle. You have an exhaled strategy at the spine. You can inhale at the lower rib cage, aka a wide infrasternal angle. So you can inhale and exhale. The problem is you are doing so with a loss of movement options in the body. Let's flip-flop that with someone who's narrow. Narrow person is going to be utilizing more of an inhalation strategy at the spine. So the sacrum's going to tip back, the whole spine's going to tip posteriorly. So they're getting more air in. They still got to be able to get the air out. The way that they're going to get the air out is by compressing the lower rib cage, using an exhalation position of the lower ribs. That doesn't mean that the diaphragm is ascended in this case. This is a little bit of a tricky point about this. Because if the diaphragm were able to ascend, well, then you would have an exhalation strategy throughout the body. But consider this: if I'm utilizing an inhalation strategy, so spine's moved posteriorly, there's air in the lungs. If the diaphragm ascended, the air would have to go out. So I have to find a different way to achieve that exhaled strategy at the lower rib cage. So what happens is the diaphragm actually descends even further to the point where it changes its line of pull on the lower rib cage. And it allows it to, instead of expanding the rib cage out, compress the rib cage in. And there's actually a good research article, which I'll link in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/infrasternal-angle-compensations. That's the URL. Just go to zachcouples.com at some point this weekend. So the diaphragm flattens, changes the line of pull on the lower ribs, allows for compression. Then you're going to have more of an exhalation strategy at the lower rib cage. And that's the first layer of compensation that you will see with someone who has a narrow infrasternal angle and a wide infrasternal angle. Wide infrasternal angle, exhaled spine, inhaled lower rib cage. That's the compensation. Narrow infrasternal angle, inhaled spine, exhaled lower rib cage. Lower rib cage is the compensation. Now, Eric asked, what would your test findings be in this case? Let's just say the only compensation that occurred was at the lower rib cage. With inhalation, the general movement of the body, now obviously there's going to be parts where it's extended, but just the general rule of thumb to create expansive properties throughout the body is there's going to be more flexion, abduction, and external rotation occurring. So if that's the case, if I'm inhaled and I'm stuck in that strategy, going the other direction, extension, adduction, and internal rotation measures ought to be limited. So that would be your test findings. The other test finding for someone who's narrow with that inhaled spine strategy is they'll be able to exhale and close the lower rib cage, but they won't be able to open it up. Flip-flop that with the wide infrasternal angle. Exhalation is associated with extension, adduction, and internal rotation. If I'm utilizing an exhalation strategy, I'm not going to be able to go the opposite direction. So measures of flexion, abduction, and external rotation ought to be limited. At the rib cage, the person should be able to create that lateral and superior movement of the ribs during inhalation, but the angle will not depress and get smaller during exhalation. And that's your baseline layer of compensation. Now, I'm sure if you're doing various measures like your boy does, you've probably seen narrows or you've probably seen wides who don't fit that bill particularly. A common example of that would be someone who's a wide infrasternal angle that presents with hip internal rotation restrictions. If you see someone who has limitations that are the opposite of what you've expected, in the case of the wide, they should be limited in flexion, abduction, ER, not extension, adduction, IR. The reason why that's happened is they've utilized an extra layer of compensation to try to complete the end-stage respiratory cycle. And that can occur anywhere. So in that case, if I have a loss of internal rotation as a wide infrasternal angle, that person has increased compressive forces on the posterior aspect of the pelvis, because normally they'd be in IR, boom, to widen the dimensions of the pelvis even further. So that would be an example of a secondary compensation. And these can happen anywhere in the body. The general rule of thumb is if you see a measure that you wouldn't expect, narrows should be limited in extension, adduction, and IR. Wides should be limited in flexion, abduction, ER. If you see those limitations, but you also see other stuff, you can bet your bottom dollar that they've had to cheat in some way, shape, or form to create another compensatory inhalation or exhalation strategy. Narrows are going to use secondary exhalation compensations in order to make that happen. Wides, on the other hand, are going to use secondary inhalation compensations to further complete the respiratory cycle. And that's really the long and the short of those two strategies. So to summarize your great question, Eric, you have inhalation and exhalation within the body. An inhaled strategy that the person is biased more towards that is going to utilize compensatory exhalation measures to complete respiration. That would mean a narrow infrasternal angle, and that could mean potentially other limitations elsewhere. If they haven't had secondary compensations aside from the ISA, then they're going to have restrictions in extension, adduction, IR, which is exhalation measures. The wide infrasternal angle, which would be 110 or greater, they are utilizing an exhalation strategy at the spine, so all of their compensatory measures are going to be more on the inhalation side of things. Predominantly at first at the lower rib cage, but it could occur elsewhere. They should be limited in flexion, abduction, and ER because those are inhalation measures. If you see any difference from those normal compensatory strategies, you know that secondary compensatory actions are happening. That could also be the case at the infrasternal angle itself, namely if someone can't inhale or exhale. It doesn't move at all. Awesome question, Eric. The next question comes from Ricky. Here's what Ricky asks. Zach, I've been curious about inhalation bias versus exhalation bias and how that relates to an ISA. For example, I've been looking to incorporate box squats and toe touch exercises to my workouts, and I was curious what exercises would be good for what types of biases. Great question. So, Ricky, as hopefully you've been listening to the last 16 or so minutes, but as we talked about before, an inhalation bias is generally with narrow infrasternal angles, and an exhalation bias is generally with wide infrasternal angles. So if you need to drive inhalation or exhalation, you're going to place the body in positions that would drive inhalation or exhalation mechanics. Let's use the pelvis as an easy example. So remember, when I inhale, the pelvis is going to tilt posteriorly because of sacral counternutation. Sacrum tips back. I would need to do activities that would drive this inhalation strategy, aka posterior tilting of the pelvis. A great lower body exercise that could allow that to happen would be a true squat, where I'm getting vertical displacement of the pelvis. If you want to dive in a little bit more to the mechanics, I will link a debrief in the show notes that will talk about this. So if you needed to improve inhalation mechanics, you might consider squatting as an intervention. Also, if you have movements that incorporate flexion, abduction, and ER, which a squat does, if I can get ass to grass in the bottom of a squat, the femurs are going to be more flexed, abducted, and ER'd. That will also promote inhalation mechanics. If you need exhalation-based mechanics, then you're looking at something that's going to nutate the sacrum and tilt the pelvis anteriorly. With this thing, from a lower body exercise selection, you might look at hinging as your activity to improve exhalation strategies, or activities that involve extension, adduction, and IR. So that's really how you can stratify your movement strategies that you might give someone. Now, before you push someone towards more inhalation or exhalation, the first thing you want to do is you need to ensure that that person can exhibit normal respiratory mechanics. In order to make that happen, that person has to be able to create what we like to affectionately call a stack. A stack would be having the thoracic and pelvic diaphragms atop one another. Most people do not have that relationship if they are exhibiting compensatory mechanics. So your first line of defense would be to do some degree of posterior tilt, drive some counternutation, ladies and gentlemen, so you can get the pelvic diaphragm in a more up and down position. And then complete a full exhalation, because remember, in both compensatory scenarios, the diaphragm is descended. You need to ascend the diaphragm first. So that creates that stacked position of the thoracic and pelvic diaphragms. Once you have that, then you can get wild and crazy with all of your inhalation or exhalation strategies. A quick way to see if you need more inhalation or exhalation, because as I had mentioned before, we're talking about bias. If you are more inhale bias, that doesn't mean you're a black belt at inhalation. There's also compensatory strategies that could go on top of that might make you restricted in both directions. If you can't get a full ass to grass, crapping in the woods squat, you likely have an inhalation restriction. And if you cannot touch your toes, you likely have an exhalation restriction. So once you've achieved the stack, then you're going to look at either doing things that are more squat-like to drive inhalation, or do things that are more hingy or toe touch-like to drive exhalation. Now, Ricky mentions two particular exercises that you could potentially bias towards inhalation or exhalation. Let's talk about box squats first. So with a box squat, if you have, let's say I have a narrow infrasternal angle person, you could use a box squat to have that person, or teach that individual to push up from a particular angle of a squat to work on exhaling the pelvic diaphragm. That could be a useful way to reverse the mechanics that you need. The way I would do that would be having the squat be somewhere between the 60 to 90 degree of hip flexion range, because in that range you're driving more exhalation mechanics. Have them sit on the box, take a breath of air in, get a nice good exhale, and come up. That should focus on improving the rising or exhalation strategy of the pelvic diaphragm. If I have someone who's wide, you could also use a box squat. The ranges where I can drive more inhalation mechanics are either 0 to somewhere between 45 and 60 degrees of hip flexion or below 90 degrees of hip flexion. Either of those positions will drive more inhalation mechanics. You can use the box and external load as a way to get your wide infrasternal angle people, or your people who need more inhalation bias, to cheat. So in this case, you might use the box squat to sit in a high squat, take a breath of air in, exhale, and then rise. I really like this for box jumps in particular. You could do the same thing. I have someone who I work with he's a wide infrasternal angle. And what I have him doing program-wise is I have him doing a high box sit, start at the bottom, get a nice tuck so he can get his pelvic diaphragm in that inhaled position, breathe in, exhale, and ascend up. So both strategies could drive inhalation or exhalation mechanics depending on the range that you choose and the breathing strategy. As for the toe touch, toe touches are more exhalation biased in nature, at least at the pelvis. Obviously, you have to be able to breathe in at the spine in order to have a good toe touch, like without cheating, because you do see some roundedness. So basically, a toe touch would be an exhaled pelvis, but being able to breathe in that exhaled state. You could bias either the exhalation component of the toe touch or the inhalation component of the toe touch with different foot positions. So if we remember, inhalation is flexion, abduction, ER. Exhalation is extension, adduction, IR. If I utilize inversion at the foot, that is going to be associated with more inhalation. Inversion is essentially external rotation. Plantar flexion and inversion at the foot are paired. So if you did a heels elevated toe touch, that might improve some of the inhalation mechanics needed to complete the toe touch. Namely, if you got someone who needs expansion in the upper thorax. If you have someone who can't get that sacral nutation, you could flip-flop the mechanics there. You could evert the foot, which is associated with more dorsiflexion. So having the toes up in this case could reinforce the exhalation mechanics needed to complete a toe touch. And that's really the long and the short of it, folks. If I'm restricted in inhalation, I need more things that drive inhalation mechanics. That could be counter nutation. Anything that pushes the spine posteriorly, flexion, abduction, ER. If I need exhalation mechanics, you're going to do things that move the spine forward. Hinges are great, toe touches are great. Drive extension, adduction, and IR. Before you go in either one of those directions, folks, you need to make sure that you have a stacked thoracic and pelvic diaphragm, because if you don't, you're going to be utilizing compensatory mechanics. You're not going to get the gains that your peeps want. Awesome question, Ricky. The next question. We got actually like a combo question because these are going to dive into some of the various secondary compensations that we might see with various infrasternal angle presentations. So let me knock these out one at a time. Let's go with Doman's question first. Hi, Zach. There is confusion going on in my head. I watched a video, Breathing Mechanics 101, where I was talking about the ISA, which if you sign up for my newsletter, you can get access to it, though it is a little bit dated. There you said a wide infrasternal angle is able to expand posteriorly and a narrow anteriorly. But wouldn't that be the opposite, due in fact to the narrow being more inhale biased and vice versa with the wide? Thank you for your answer. Doman, you're absolutely right. I was wrong in that. I have since furthered my understanding of the mechanics, and now the company line as of today, which is April 3rd, 2020. It's not April Fool's Day, so there ain't no joke going on this debrief. Yes, a narrow infrasternal angle should have the ability to expand posteriorly. A wide infrasternal angle should have the ability to expand anteriorly as your primary compensation. Now, are there situations where a wide could get expansion posteriorly and situations where a narrow could get expansion anteriorly? And the answer is yes. The reason why would be secondary compensations. So here's what would have to happen. Let's first go with, how in the heck could a wide get posterior expansion? So remember, wide infrasternal angle, exhaled axial skeleton, pow! They got a flat upper back, not going to get air back there. Not going to do it. How can I cheat my way to being able to create some degree of posterior expansion? If I can't breathe in normally, I can't abduct the scaps because I got all this air in the front of my chest. What I need to do is I need to change the shape and position of the thorax somehow, some way, in order to allow me to get some degree of posterior expansion. And the way that happens, folks, is this. I breathe in. I can't get air back there, so what am I going to do? Pow! I'm going to actually tilt the thorax anteriorly by depressing the sternum via the rectus damniocultus abdominis. You've seen folks who are wide infrasternal angles who might have shoulder internal rotation limitations. That's how it's done. I would not give it a shot. In that scenario, if I tilt the thorax anteriorly, well, you can see that my spine is now a little bit more rounded. That might allow certain aspects of the thorax to get posterior expansion. So actually, Doman, in that scenario, that person would have some degree of posterior expansion. They might even have full external rotation. That's one way that you could get posterior expansion. Let's go with the narrow infrasternal angle. Normally, they should have posterior expansion and they should be limited in the front. But I'm sure you've ran into a narrow infrasternal angle in your day who had crazy amounts of IR and limited ER. One of my homies is that way. So how would a narrow get a limitation in external rotation? The exact opposite. So I got my inhaled spine. I need to get air in the front of the chest somehow, some way. How can I do it? Pow! I can exhale the upper back by tilting the thorax posteriorly. And if I do that, that will reduce the amount of air I can get in certain parts of the upper thorax. And it will allow me to get some air into the front of the thorax. And in that case, ladies and gentlemen, is how you could have someone who is narrow not have posterior expansion. Colin had a follow-up question. So Colin asked, people who have kyphosis may be exhibiting a compensation for missing true posterior expansion. Yes. So if you see, a normal spine, whatever the hell that means, should have some degree of kyphosis. But if you're seeing it in particular areas, a common example might be like a Delweger's hump, they could actually be exhaling at just one area of the sternum, i.e. the manubrium, and be creating an inhalation strategy at the thorax. A lot of times what you'll see with these folks is, like if they go to do a toe touch, you'll see the flexion occurring at just one point in the spine. I'm a good example of that. I have a good picture, which I will link in the show notes. When I go and touch my toes, do not show me where the wild goose goes, but when I go and touch my toes, I hinge somewhere in the middle part of the thorax, and you can see that my upper thorax is flat, and then below that point it's also flat. So that would be a way that I'm achieving a kyphosis, but it's just occurring at one or two or however many segments, just not the full spine. So there's your answer. So to summarize, if you see things that do not match the normal compensatory strategy, that's because there's been an added layer of compensation. Javier's question, which is in the similar vein. Is it possible to have a narrow infrasternal angle with a flat spine, but abducted scapula, shoulder flexion, and ER limitation. The person that we are talking about is that person who we just mentioned. So the person who has somehow, the narrow, who has posteriorly tilted the thorax to some degree, created some compression in the upper thorax, the entire upper thorax, that individual would have flexion, ER, and abduction restrictions if I get increased compressive forces posteriorly all the way. Because there's certain segments of the spine that are correlated with being able to complete some of these measures. So for external rotation, you need to be able to get air into the mid to lower thorax, T6, T8 most likely. To get shoulder flexion, you would need to get air into T2, T4-ish. And it has to do with where the upward and downward rotators are located, as well as the shape of fiber orientation of the subscapularis. So that would be how you could have those restrictions. If somehow a narrow infrasternal angle person has compressed themselves in those areas of the spine, they will most certainly have the restrictions that you're talking about. What you going to do about it though? In order to improve that, you need to choose activities that would encourage expansion in those regions. If it's a narrow, I would definitely start with an inversion-based strategy. That will allow you to restore the stacked position, but also too, if I tip my person more towards inversion, like if you look at my water bottle here, as I tilt the water bottle down, one for my homies, you'll see water, well you can't see, but you can envision that water is going to go to the top half of this water bottle. The lungs work the same way. If I tilt the body where the pelvis is higher than the upper part or the thorax, I'm going to get better lung fill in the upper parts of the lungs. That's going to get expansion into some of the uppermost parts of the rib cage. So you might want to start with an inversion-based strategy. See what happens. Then with your testing, you might look at reaching in various directions to get air into those specific areas. I have a good debrief that outlines reaching, which I'll link. But if I go from 0 to 60, that's going to get you that external rotation back. And anything 120 to 180 at the shoulder is going to allow you to get that upper thorax expansion, assuming in both those cases you have a stack. So that's what you would do, Javier. Great question. The last question comes from Jay. Here's what Jay asks. It's regarding breathing strategies for infrasternal angles. Are there ever situations for wide ISA people like myself to use open mouth exhales? I know the use of open versus closed mouth is just to facilitate activation of certain areas that are normally needed for these infrasternal angle presentations, but are there exceptions to this, and what might those be? Or does it even matter? Great question. Breathing strategies for infrasternal angles. A narrow infrasternal angle first. That person, because they have an exhaled ribcage position, they can better generate tension in the abs. They have more of a concentric strategy. So you need to be able to create an exhalation that allows the diaphragm to ascend without increasing compressive forces. Reducing resistance in the mouth is a way to do that. So that's why with those folks, we encourage open mouth size. Big area, you can get more air out, less resistance. For a wide infrasternal angle, it's the exact opposite strategy. That person needs to compress the rib cage down. So you want to create a bit more resistance. The way you would do that, make your kissy face, duck face on IG, go ahead, take a screen cap. With that, you want to get a full exhalation, but with a closed mouth, or not closed, but pursed lips, so that way you create a little bit more resistance to close the angles. Now, what Jay is asking is, well, is it going to kill me if I do an open mouth exhale? Would there ever be a time in which you would do that? So with either of these, you could cue either breathing strategy and get good results. When we're talking about getting specific with certain breathing strategies based on infrasternal angle presentation, we're talking about maximizing the probability of success. based on some of the biomechanics that we've discussed in this debrief, I can increase my odds of success by making sure I do everything in my power to create a dynamic infrasternal angle. And mouth position is one of those strategies that could allow that to happen. Is going the other way, doing the strategy that's not recommended, going to hurt you? No. It could reduce your odds of success, but you're still getting air out. And a lot of times I have had people, especially if I'm working with them online, where I've mismeasured the infrasternal angle, especially in my earlier days when I was young and naive and I needed the work. We still did the exhalation strategies and got good results. Would I ever intentionally program someone, and in this case a wide, who should be giving a little bit more resistance, a soft exhale? And the answer is yes, I would. The time in which I would give a wide infrasternal angle person a open mouth sigh is if they could not get any air volume out with the pursed-lipped exhale. So maybe they go, pfft. They do like that short exhale, and I want to encourage them to go slow. That would be really one instance. Or if it was painful to create that pursed-lipped exhale because they're creating too much resistance or too much tension in the abs. If you have either of those situations, I think an open mouth is more than appropriate. And that would really be the only time that I would consider that. So to summarize your question, Jay, narrows, open mouth sigh, wides, pursed-lipped, both go slow to get as much air out as possible. That can increase probability of making the ISA dynamic, but it's not going to be a deal breaker if you don't do that, especially if you don't know how to measure infrasternal angles. Now, can you go the other way? Absolutely. An open mouth sigh is always a good choice because if you got someone who has pain with exhalation or they just can't get a full exhale out, open mouth sigh is a good way to do that. Awesome question. I think that's a good stopping point for us today, though. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope that the quarantine and all that is treating you well. I know these are tough times, but hopefully, government gets us some buck, so it makes it a little bit easier. And if you're a small business owner, strongly look into some of these loans they got. I was just kind of reading up some stuff on that, and it's a pretty sweet deal. So please check that out. Give it a shot. I strongly encourage you. If you can get free money and it tides you over, that would be great. Thank you all, though, for tuning in. You've been a beautiful, sexy, outstanding audience. If you want to learn more, you can find me at zachcouples.com. That's where I'm at, folks. That is where I live. I also live somewhere. But zachcouples.com. Subscribe to the newsletter while you're there. Thank you, Felix. Subscribe to the newsletter while you're there. You'll get access to a lot of the free stuff that I talked about. The Human Matrix Foundations course, which leads up to Human Matrix, the course of courses, of course. That if you want a really good overview of some of the basics you need to really grasp the material here, it's a free course. So check out the Foundations course. I have some links to it there. And you'll also get the Common Compensations workbook, which will allow you to start looking at movement in this frame that we're talking about. You'll also get 5 hours of talks, a free acute to chronic workload calculator, goodies from your boy every Friday. I'll take care of you because you the fan. Also, we're at my website. I got a lot of services. The first service I'm going to talk about is Human Matrix, my seminar, where if you like this stuff but you want to learn how to practically apply it, definitely check out my seminar. I am probably going to be postponing, and by probably I mean most likely going to be postponing a lot of the quarter 1, quarter 2 seminars, unfortunately, because of the virus. But I hope if things go according to plan and this stuff starts to calm down, I'll be hosting them definitely in later 2020 and hopefully 2021. We'll just see how coronavirus goes. Definitely check us out, though. I got links to the dates in the show notes. Other services I can offer you, though, that are coronavirus free would be my online services, a movement consultation. If you toy, you're not moving as well as you'd like to, or if you have clients who are toy and that's limiting their ability to perform some of the home exercises that you might be doing via Zoom. Well, let's via Zoom as a team and work on your clients or your movement capabilities so you can get the most out of your time where you're in quarantine. You might not be able to get gains right now because you don't have access to a gym, but you can improve your movement quality and feel better. Movement consultation is a great way of doing that. We could kick that up a notch, Emeril Lagasse style, by moving towards online training as well. With that, we can take that movement consultation results that we got via my testing that I use, and we work on exercises over the session and apply that under a fitness lens so you can maximize your fitness goals, whatever they are. And I'm sure, now with the coronavirus, it's a good time to try some other avenues. So give it a shot if you could, please. Or if you want to learn how to apply some of these concepts with your people, especially virtually. Your boy has been doing virtual consults for a while now. It's about 3 years. And if you're just getting into it, which I encourage you to do so, check out my guide to remote coaching if you don't know about it. But we can talk through how to set that up, one, and two, how to coach your people so they can get maximal results and outcomes while this is going on. Definitely look out for that. Once you've scoured zachcouples.com, you've read every single one of my blogs. You might want to go a few other places. I would check out the Zach Couples Show on iTunes and Stitcher. Because guess what, folks? There's 114 other debriefs out there, and the lighting wasn't always good. We definitely didn't have the dual camera angles, if you know what I'm sizzling. So you might just want to give me a listen on your car ride or your walk while maintaining social distance. It's a good way to circumvent the social distancing because if you're wearing earphones, you can keep your boy close to you. And I want to be close. Let me in. Once you've done that, check me out on social media. Facebook/ZCouples. My Twitter handle is @ZCouples. I'm on that Instagram, baby. Zach, Z-A-C, Couples, C-U-P-P-L-E-S. And last but not least, check me out on YouTube if you want to practice some activities that work on improving your inhalation and exhalation mechanics. There's a gang of them on YouTube. I would definitely check them out. Thank you all for tuning in. You've been an amazing audience. I'm thinking of all of you. Best of luck. Keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving. And I'll see you next time. Deuces.